come to you a sinner, and I humbly repent for my sins.
Wait, hold up. Hey, I see someone.
Hey, say something. Hey, these bitch niggas killed my brothers.
What we've been told is that the only way that Jews can be safe is if Palestinians are not safe.
I mean, you're treated like a diplomat of terrorism.
Of all the Nazi leaders who had escaped at the end of the war, none was more hated there than the architect and supervisor of the attempt to eliminate the Jewish race completely.
Why are you so angry? See, you young men are dying of thirst.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America.
In the wake of World War II, a Nazi named Adolf Eichmann was tried in Jerusalem for his participation in the Holocaust. The narrative was simple. This cold, calculating monster of unfathomable evil is the direct cause of the deaths of millions of Jews. And why not? Certainly this is a convenient explanation, that of some inner depravity intrinsic in certain human beings. Certainly this is easier to understand, Hannah Arendt might say, than the truth. In her controversial and groundbreaking book on Eichmann's trial, political theorist and historian Hannah Arendt claims that Eichmann was gripped not by sadism or ideological fervor, but instead selfishness, careerism, and obedience. In fact, a dozen psychiatrists certified him as normal, one adding, quote, "more normal at any rate than I am after having examined him." Arendt's claims fly in the face of the predominant understanding of Eichmann as a mass-murdering savage. But her thesis, what she calls the banality of evil, goes far beyond simply arguing that Eichmann was an ordinary man. She says that by centering the perpetrators of evil, we are ignoring the far more sinister structural and political evil that manipulates people like Eichmann into their evil deeds. Eichmann was not on trial, by the prosecution's own admission, but anti-Semitism itself. Quote, "The tragedy of Jewry as a whole was to be the central concern." It was a show trial, Arendt says. Its goal to make an example of Eichmann, and thus to justify the existence of the State of Israel, who, let's not forget, was in the middle of their ethnic cleansing campaign of Palestine. Arendt was harsh toward Zionists like David Ben-Gurion, the mastermind of the Eichmann trial and the state's first prime minister, who she says used the Holocaust to garner sympathy for the Jewish state. And she has a point. Ben-Gurion once said, quote, "If I knew that it was possible to save all the children of Germany by transporting them to England, and only half by transferring them to the land of Israel, I would choose the latter. For before us lies not only the numbers of these children, but the historical reckoning of the people of Israel." Later in this video, I'll highlight an opposing perspective from a member of the Judenrat, Jewish leadership, who worked with Eichmann. And he pushes back, in my opinion rightfully so, on certain aspects of what Arendt wrote. Now I want to be crystal clear that neither Arendt nor myself are absolving Eichmann of his guilt. He is absolutely guilty and got what he deserved. Not thinking critically about your actions is of course no excuse for genocide, but the reason that I want to explore this topic is that I see the same thoughtless conformity to power and money all over the world today. And I think it's very dangerous. Additionally, there are several critics of Arendt's thesis, people who say that Eichmann really was an ideological racist, but I think we have to bear in mind that anti-Semitism was rampant in Europe at the time. So I actually don't think that these criticisms disprove Arendt's overall thesis of Eichmann as an ordinary, banal man. This banality actually could have contributed even to his susceptibility for Nazi rhetoric. The second disclaimer that I want to make is that this is not going to be a philosophical endeavor into the concept of evil. The literature on this subject is incredibly vast, and to be honest, I don't think I've read enough of it to give any sort of a nuanced analysis. So that's the reason I want to focus more on the exploitation of our psychology by those in power. In our effort to refocus on the systemic evil that allowed the Nazi Party to flourish, we should ask, why is it that Eichmann was so relentlessly focused on his career? Why is it that authority held such a grip on him? Why is it that a man who held no deep hatred for Jews signed off on their deaths by the thousands? This toxic society we've created, one of voracious growth, of achievement, of submission, of narcissism, has only grown more unrelenting in the years since Eichmann. The tides of fascism are rising once again, and the same tricks used by Nazis to breed complicity in their citizens and participation in their officials, the same tools used by genocidal regimes from Rwanda to Israel, are being activated against us as we speak. Our growing disconnection only intensifies our radicalization, and our disenfranchisement with capital-fueled politics is being taken advantage of by grifters and hypocrites. In this video, I will explore how our psychology can be exploited to turn ordinary people into mindless drones, capable of incredible violence and depravity. I'll take a look at history, science, and fiction, from Terry Gilliam's Brazil to Kendrick Lamar's Good Kid, Mad City. The factors laid out in this video are tools of imperialism, and through understanding them, we can resist them. Through education and conversation, we can cut through the lies. Through collective action and solidarity, we can change the world. Kendrick Lamar's The Art of Peer Pressure, the inciting incident of its album, Good Kid, Mad City, tells the story of Kendrick and his homies acting fools, driving around Compton, drinking, smoking, fiending for conflict. Kendrick repeatedly states that what he's doing is out of his nature,
but shit, I'm with the homies.
It's a soft form of peer pressure, not coercive but unspoken. The kind of peer pressure we're all familiar with, especially when we're young. We want to act hard, so we flex and puff our chests and act like something we're not, cause shit, we're with the homies. Well, this song and the album as a whole show the dangers of succumbing to this pressure. In Kendrick's case, this means a cycle of escalating violence.
We seen 3 niggas in colors we didn't like, then start interrogating. Rush a nigga quick and then we laugh about it. That's ironic, cause I never been violent until I'm with the homies. That's right.
These actions lead to Kendrick getting jumped, and one thing leads to another. Next thing you know, his friend Dave gets killed in a shootout.
Wait, hold up. Hey, I see something.
Hey, say something. Hey, these bitch niggas killed my brother.
The first verse of Sing About Me, I'm Dying of Thirst is rapped from the perspective of Dave's brother, leaving a voicemail for Kendrick in the aftermath of Dave's death. He's coming to grips with his life, how he feels trapped in the gang lifestyle that he's been conditioned into.
This pyro shit been in me forever, so forever I'ma push it wherever, whenever.
Kendrick is one in a million, a generational talent who is able to escape the hood through his music. But Dave's brother doesn't have this dream.
Niggas like me never prosper, prognosis of a problem child. I'm proud and well devoted.
Dave's shooting clearly shapes Kendrick's life and worldview, and unfortunately it's far from the only friend he'll lose to gang violence. As with Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem, the story of Good Kid, Mad City is about institutional evil more than any single person's evil deeds. Sing About Me's second verse is rapped from the perspective of the sister of Keisha, a girl whose story Kendrick told on Keisha's song, intending to elevate the tragedy of Keisha's story. But Keisha's sister took offense to Kendrick for
How could you ever just put her on blast and shit, judging her past and shit?
Kendrick knows that the fate which awaited Dave and Keisha would be his fate if he didn't quote-unquote make it.
Cursing the life for 20 generations at the hurt soul. Exactly what'd happen if I ain't continue rapping.
The broken system leads to the fracturing of black households, gang violence, and suffering communities. Fractured communities mean that in places like Compton or East Baltimore, as we see in HBO's The Wire, gangs are often the only way young men can find a sense of belonging and purpose. Through initiations, young men or boys are coerced into actions they may have otherwise thought reprehensible. All this is only made worse by the terror of police brutality and systemic racism. And it seems to me that the underlying cause of these problems is tied to the Palestinian plight. Ta-Nehisi Coates, a Black American writer, recently released a book called The Message, which chronicles a trip to Palestine that he says changed his life. He recognizes the Black struggle and America's history of Jim Crow segregation in what Palestinians experience on a daily basis through brutal apartheid and occupation. Gangs are demonized and their members dehumanized by the US media, just like Palestinian terrorists, while the root of the problem is ignored. It means that many Americans see no problem with the disproportionate violence used by police or Israeli soldiers, because they are rooting out the cause of our suffering. They are acting in self-defense. Howdy folks, hope you're enjoying the video so far. I wanted to share an exciting announcement that I am starting a Discord server for the channel. So if you enjoy the types of things that I talk about, I would love to sort of build out the community a little bit more. I've got, I think like 13,000 of you subscribed, but you know, the YouTube comment section can get a little bit messy and hard to keep up with too. So this is my attempt to connect with you all on a more personal level. You'll be able to keep up with announcements for the channel. I'll be sharing behind the scenes content. And then there's also some discussion channels for books, film, philosophy, politics, basically all the things that I talk about in this channel. But if you know anything about me, you know that my attention goes in a million different directions depending on the month and the season. So who knows what it'll turn into. There very well could end up being several more channels down the line. But anyways, open to feedback on this. Hopefully you guys are excited about it. I'll include a link in my description, and I hope to see you all there. In the 1960s, psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted a series of experiments in which participants were told by an authority figure to administer electric shocks of increasing voltage to actors who would cry and plead for the participants to stop. The authority figure would tell them to continue with the experiment, and despite the increasingly pained responses, the experiment found that 65% of participants would continue on to the highest voltage of shock. It's important to note, however, that when the experiment was repeated with a second Confederate who was either willing to perform the task or refused to perform it, participants' obedience to authority ranged widely, from below 10% with an unwilling Confederate to above 90% with a willing Confederate. This just further exhibits the influence of conformity and peer pressure discussed previously. In Timothy Williams' sociological study of the motivations for perpetrators of genocide, he says that obedience to authority is most influential when the authoritarian hierarchy is entered voluntarily, or within a strong state with a lack of dissidence. It makes sense then that this was Adolf Eichmann's key defense time and again, and a favorite for perpetrators within the Nazi Party. A similarly strong state is shown in the 1985 film Brazil, which takes place, in director Terry Gilliam's words, sometime in the 20th century on the LA-Belfast border. That is to say, not in any particular time or place. Our protagonist is Sam, an unambitious cog in the totalitarian machine, a dreamer who cares more about beauty and love than his career. Sam turns a blind eye to the oppressive injustice of the government for which he works. After all, what can he do? He thinks this rebellious complacency accomplishes something, but it doesn't, beyond a shallow pacification of his suppressed guilt. When a series of mistakes by the incompetent government leads to the death of an innocent man, Sam offers to hand-deliver a refund check for the man's family, again hoping to pacify his guilt. When he leaves his bureaucratic cocoon and interacts for the first time with the real world, he sees the true consequences of the totalitarian state. During his trip to the dead man's house, Sam becomes defensive after the man's wife is angry that her wrongfully imprisoned husband was tortured to death.
He hasn't done anything. He was good. What have you done with his body?
During this exchange, Sam spots the literal girl from his dreams and goes off to chase her, by extension running away from the reality of the crime he knows he's complicit in. After this, in quick succession, Sam discovers that his friend Jack Lint is wrapped up in some suspicious business.
Jack! Ah!
He hears a disturbing torture scene being cheerily transcribed by a woman who herself is a reflection of the Eichmann-esque thoughtless obedience to authority.
Can I help you?
He has his views on terrorism challenged.
How many terrorists have you met, Sam? Actual terrorists?
And eventually comes to grips with the nasty reality of the fact that the state are the real bad guys. It's implied that he always knew his employer was evil at some level, but it's not until someone he loves is threatened that he is thrust into action against it. This is a common response to authority, obeying and ignoring the oppression until you or someone you love is directly threatened. I think about that quote from Martin Niemöller. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out, because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Capitalism encourages self-absorption, which fascism feeds on. The two systems are inextricably linked. We are meant to reject our common humanity in favor of egoism, tribalism, and xenophobia. But this quote and Sam's tragic character arc shows that complicity in the face of hatred will only lead to your own destruction. We meet Jack Lint 15 minutes into Brazil, and it's immediately clear that he is a conflicted career man, playing the game, as it were.
Jack Lint is a lesson to you. He doesn't have your brains, but he's got the ambition. You haven't got the ambition.
He's an outwardly happy family man, but Sam can tell he is hiding something.
What's the problem?
Problem? No problem. Everything's fine. Wonderful. Marvelous.
The next time we see Jack, he is having some sort of a breakdown, which we later understand is because his job that he's worked so hard for is basically a state-sanctioned torturer. And the blood all over his scrubs, combined with the audio his secretary is transcribing, tells us what he's been up to. Jack's breakdown reminds me of the horror that Adolf Eichmann wrote about in his journal when he had to visit the Nazi concentration camps and saw piles of corpses being thrown into mass grave sites.
Still, I saw how a column of naked Jews filed into a large hall to be gassed. There they were killed, as I was told, by something called cyanic acid. The fact is that Eichmann did not see much.
We have no reason to believe that this is fabricated for the court. After all, it's just his personal journal. It seems that Eichmann really was sickened by what the Nazis were doing, just not sickened enough to outweigh the benefits he gains from his position. When one is assigned a role, for Jack Lint, torturing suspected terrorists, for Eichmann, Jewish emigration and population management, they internalize the values and belief of the role. The role then shuts off the traditional morality and values that govern their lives when they are in normal mode. The ego defense mechanism of compartmentalization allows us to mentally bind conflicting aspects of our beliefs and experiences into separate chambers.
Here's somebody who's got his brain split down the middle. He can do one job, and he can be the good family man and still be a functioning human being. The objective attitude that Jack shows is really, I think, what America keeps doing more than anywhere. I mean, it's the idea that you somehow overcome the failings of your humanness by becoming objective, and you stand above it, and then everything is treated equally, fairly, all of that. That this will make a better world. The fact is, it makes a nightmare world. It's like it's getting rid of passion. It's getting rid of all of the things that we're always told are primitive and base, and that society should be ridding itself of. And it scares me because the people like Jack Lint succeed in that world.
James Waller posits that if the values of the role conflict with those of the person, over time there is a psychological tendency to adjust their underlying beliefs and values to what is consistent with their roles, thus actually reshaping the person into a more violent, aggressive person capable of continually committing acts of genocide. Waller also says that violent roles can be worn and slipped in and out of. These tendencies help explain what Arendt terms inner emigrants, people who had held positions, even high ones, in the Third Reich, but claimed they had always been inwardly opposed to the regime. Other factors that further Eichmann and Jack's motivation for evil are self-interest and opportunism. This is especially true for Eichmann and members of the SS, whose members engaged in rivalries, quarrels, squabbling, because everyone vied for supremacy. In his trial, Eichmann often couldn't even remember critical facts that would have benefited his defense, but he remembers in detail various events that had a direct impact on his career. Jack Lint's focus on his career is apparent with his first talk with Sam, in which he is quick to boast of how far he's risen while criticizing Sam, who is stuck in a dead-end apartment.
Let a friend tell you. Your life is going wrong. Record is a dead-end department. No security level worth a damn. It's impossible to get noticed.
I know. Wonderful. Marvelous. Perfect. See you, Jack. Give my regards to Alison and the twins. Triplets. Triplets. God, how time flies.
Later on, he rejects Sam when he becomes an impediment on his career, and finally becomes angry at Sam for putting him in the position that he has to torture him.
You stupid bastard. Jack. How could you do this to me?
Jack, I'm frightened.
Oh, how do you think I feel? You shit!
Jack!
Shut up!
Though he doesn't seem too broken up about it in the final scene.
He's got away from us, Jack. Afraid you're right, Mr. Heltman. He's gone.
Timothy Williams' study points out several more factors that contribute to participation in genocide, such as de-individuation, the bystander effect, fear, ideology, threatened egotism, sadism, and more. His point, which I've attempted to elucidate here, is that motivation towards evil is multifaceted and layered. But two more facets that he didn't talk about, perhaps because they are more structural, but nevertheless are vital in understanding how those in power manipulate us, are propaganda and indoctrination. The documentary Israelism, The Awakening of American Jews, explores Israeli propaganda through the American Jewish education system. The documentary analyzes just how inseparable Judaism and Israel are considered in the U.S. by many.
To me, it's the same. You can't separate it. Israel is Judaism, and Judaism is Israel. And that is who I am, and that is my identity. And I think every single thing that I experienced along my life has melded into that. Like there was never, a divide for me. I mean, it gets in your blood.
These Jewish children, who of course don't know any better, are taught classic Zionist lies like this.
It was presented to us that Israel was basically an empty wasteland when the Jews arrived. There were some Arabs there, they said, but there was no organized people. they had really treated the land poorly. Yeah, there are Palestinians, and they just want to kill us all and want us to leave the land.
In terms of Israel's occupation and apartheid, which has been happening for decades, they are not taught anything real or substantive.
Learning about the quote-unquote conflict is something that is part of programming, as something that you have to learn how to defend Israel from the lies that other people are saying, and you have to be able to tell people the truth.
Simone Zimmerman, one of the interviewees and founder of If Not Now, talks about defending Israel at a student government meeting from a divestment bill and how she was sent talking points from her parents.
I just knew it was this bad thing that I had to fight.
It is anti-Semitism. It is.
You are trying to make me feel marginalized on my own campus.
And I remember all of us going, well, you shouldn't boycott Israel because it's applying a double standard, and you shouldn't boycott Israel because it's unfair to single out Israel.
Please, I beg of you, I beg you, please, to have compassion and to remember that we are alienating students, and I am devastated by this bill. I am a human being.
I still remember you have these Palestinian students who get up and said, you know, Jewish students, you are crying about feeling silenced and marginalized. You know, my aunts and cousins didn't sleep for weeks while bombs were falling overhead in Gaza. What do you have to say to that?
If divestment is hostile, then where do we begin to describe the hostility of a military occupation?
Now, this on its own should be enough to piss us all off, but the icing on the cake for me is the militarization of Jewish American children.
So when I was in high school, I went on this Jewish youth trip to Israel, and one of the programs we did was called Gadna, where we spent a day pretending to be soldiers in the Israeli army. We wore army uniforms, and stuff like that was just sort of a normal part of what our childhood looked like.
At summer camp, in the middle of the night, they would wake us up and take us out. Sometimes that was to pull pranks, and other times I remember doing military games, using the command pozatsta, sneaking around. So anytime the commander, who was one of our counselors, said pozatsta, we would all get on the ground, and they made a game out of it. When you're a young kid, that really drills it into you that this is something important. And I wanted to be a part of that.
The documentary interviews several former Israeli soldiers, and hearing about their experiences sheds light on an important issue that ties back into the motivations for evil we just discussed.
One of the things that I did routinely was a mission where you are ordered to take over a Palestinian family's home and use that house as a military point. No warrant, you don't call in advance, it's a military occupation. And during my service, there were many moments where I saw myself acting violently, and there were moments of shame.
Another Israeli soldier talks about a time he was transporting a prisoner blindfolded with his hands tied, and another group of 8 soldiers grabbed the detainee, threw him to the ground, and beat him brutally for multiple minutes.
I felt responsible, but my commander wasn't saying anything, so how could I say anything?
And keep in mind, they only interviewed American Israeli soldiers who defected. Think about all the ones who didn't. The one exception to this being a former soldier who serves as a Hillel rep at UConn, though of course he doesn't see a problem with what he's done or is doing. So when Hannah Arendt talks about banality, this is what she means. Not being able or willing to see how the system perpetuates violence and evil, and instead simply conforming without thinking too hard. Quote, "The longer one listened to Eichmann, the more obvious it became that his inability to speak was closely connected with an inability to think, that is, to think from the standpoint of somebody else." I have family members who serve or have served in the US military. And while I think that they are deeply misguided, I know that they are not evil. They're the product of military propaganda. Sports games marching to the drum of war, the cultural fetishization of our troops and veterans, all while ignoring the fact that our government actually doesn't give a shit about veterans. The fact that we pledge allegiance to the US flag before school. The main argument that I hear in defense of these family members is that they joined the military because it paid for their education. Well, yeah, that's exactly my point. I'm all for free education, but it's hilarious and oh so American that virtually the only way to get it is to serve in the military. When you think about it, it's no real mystery why the US and Israel are such good buddies. We see ourselves in them. We see the manifest destiny in Israel's dream of greater Israel, and we cheer. We see the racist apartheid and the branding of natives as savages, and we are brought back to a simpler time, when white people set the rules and enforce them with violence. The media, of course, plays a huge role in shaping the narratives of how we understand this conflict and the entire world. Unfortunately, in our capital-driven media landscape dominated by massive conglomerates, it's difficult to get an accurate picture of the news. I'm going to be unpacking this further in detail in the companion to this video coming soon. But for now, I'd like to present the sponsor of this video, Ground News. Media literacy is something very important to me, as you'll see with the next video, and Ground News is a great tool for improving your own. It's an app and a website that combines news from around the world in one place so you can compare coverage across outlets. For every news source, you can see if they have a political bias, how reliable their reporting is, and who owns them. They even have a blind spot feed that highlights news disproportionately covered by one side of the political spectrum. I've been using Ground News to critically examine the media landscape and see the gaps in my own knowledge, and I think that tools like this go a long way in really getting a full picture of a given news story, and you will inevitably open yourself up to more diverse perspectives, things you may not otherwise have seen. You can use the link in my description for 40% off their Vantage subscription or 15% off any other subscription option. Your subscription helps support transparency in news, and it also gives a little bit of kickback to support the channel, so thank you in advance, those that do. One of the reasons this video has taken so long to make is that I was essentially trying to boil down my entire philosophy for engaging with politics, myself, my community, and the world into a few key talking points. But as Emma Goldman said, quote, "What I believe is a process rather than a finality. Finalities are for gods and governments, not for the human intellect." So I'd like to dedicate this conclusion to 3 values that I think are essential in building a better world and resisting the corrupting nature of power and money. Terry Gilliam goes to great lengths to humanize the perpetrators of state violence in Brazil. The security guards rehearsing Noel, the police officer running away on fire after Sam causes him to crash, the stormtrooper-esque guards complaining about their gear, and, of course, Jack the family man. Gilliam challenges us to look beyond these characters' evil deeds to the core of why they do it, how any resistance in their authoritarian society is futile. In Kendrick Lamar's album, Mr. Morale and the Big Stepper, he attacks the idea that traumatized black men who continue the cycle of abuse are rejected by the world. I think Kendrick's methods are somewhat flawed, such as his platforming of Kodak Black, who was indicted for sexually assaulting a teenage girl in 2017. I don't really agree with this, and I think it actually detracts from the message, but thematically it does make sense. Let's look at these lines from Mother I Sober.
I know the secrets, every other rapper sexually abused. I see them daily, burying they pain in chains and tattoos. So listen close, before you start to pass judgment on how we move, learn how we cope. So I set free the hearts filled with hatred, keep our bodies sacred. As I set free all your abusers, this is transformation.
I don't think it's a stretch to think that Kendrick is referring to Kodak here. You don't have to like it, and to be honest, I think that Kendrick goes too far in his attack on cancel culture, which I feel is way overblown. If Kodak was really canceled, he wouldn't be making 7 figures a year. But Kendrick's larger point of empathizing with, transforming, and redeeming people who've committed evil is powerful. Now, I briefly touched on Arendt's criticisms of Jewish leadership in their cooperation with Nazis during the Holocaust, but I want to present a different perspective that will further my point about the importance of empathy. The Last of the Unjust is a documentary that tells the story of Rabbi Benjamin Mermelstein, a Jewish leader who worked closely with Adolf Eichmann in the inner workings of Theresienstadt, what Eichmann called a model ghetto. Mermelstein's testimony is moving and filled with cynicism and vitriolic hate for Eichmann, who he calls a demon. Mermelstein directly scoffs at the idea that Eichmann was some banal man who was just following orders, pointing to his corruption and quickness to anger, such as an instance where he bursted into Mermelstein's office in anger and pointed a gun at him. Mermelstein does not try to sugarcoat the suffering and depravity that he inflicted upon the Jewish inmates of Theresienstadt, but he stands by these actions and says that he undertook this task to save as many lives as he could at all costs. He points to several instances of working with the Nazis to achieve the emigration of a group of Austrian Jews to a place that they'd be safe. On the other hand, Mermelstein was widely condemned and even hated for his part in the Holocaust, and he does admit that he liked the power granted in his position. Mermelstein is a complex and morally questionable figure, but my point with this video has been to emphasize the importance of rational empathy. What this means is that we should seek to understand the reason for all these figures' actions. You don't have to share in their emotions or excuse their actions, but by dismissing them as evil to the core, you are falling into the trap that systems of power have created to turn us against one another. The Last of the Unjust is an important reminder that universals about human nature are never a good idea. Arendt, I believe, falls prey to these temptations with statements about the, quote, whole truth, and the attitude that she understood Eichmann better than anyone. But I think that there's a reason why Arendt's writing has lived in our minds for so long. I think that we know deep down that there is truth in it. I think we all see a bit of ourselves in Eichmann. I suppose I should just speak for myself. There are things that I've done that I feel deep shame over, things I've never admitted to anyone. And I've had a privileged life, let's be real. I've never been tempted with true depravity. Who's to say what I would be capable of if put in a different position or raised with different values? It can be easy to take a holier-than-thou approach when somebody does wrong, to scream online about the injustice, but in doing so, we are discarding not just the humanity of the wrongdoer, but of ourselves as well. Solidarity is more than a buzzword, and it doesn't mean posting a black square to your Instagram. It's a recognition that we all depend on each other. In the words of Martin Luther King Jr., quote, "Before you finish eating your breakfast in the morning, you've depended on more than half the world. This is the way our universe is structured. It is its interrelated quality. We aren't going to have peace on Earth until we recognize this basic fact of the interrelated structure of all reality." The rich and powerful want us to forget this. It's why Amazon and Starbucks and Walmart make it so easy to ignore all the labor that went into your new Fitbit or your coffee beans or your TV or your 40-pack of Gushers. Commodity fetishism, as Marx calls this. I think about community response to disasters when people put aside their differences to help one another. I think about Seattle's general strike of 1919, when the city shut down as 65,000 workers walked out of their jobs. Did the city collapse in on itself? No. The striking workers supported one another through syndicates that served meals, made deliveries, and carried on the essential functions with astonishing efficiency. The strike ultimately failed in achieving its goals, but my point is, when push comes to shove, humans, for the most part, have each other's backs. This is where anarchist philosophy, with its values of solidarity, mutual aid, and free thought, starts to make a lot of sense. The beauty of this philosophy is that it can and should start at the small scale among your communities and expand outward from there. In the words of Ursula K. Le Guin, human solidarity is our one hope. And the only way we can create a brighter future is by making an effort to recognize this. So far, I've painted a pretty grim picture about the extent to which human intellect is undermined by psychological motivations. But I want to be very clear, it doesn't have to be this way.
Do you believe in common sense? I mean, you're
Absolutely.
You do.
I believe in Cartesian common sense. I think people have the capacities to see through the deceit in which they're ensnared, but they got to make the effort.
The key here is making an effort. I admit for much of my life, I didn't make an effort. I grew disenchanted with politics after the pervasiveness of elite interests was proven with Hillary Clinton's defeat of Bernie Sanders in the 2016 Democratic primary. How'd that go, by the way? And I remained this way through my early 20s. During this time, where I was struggling with other physical and mental health issues, I stopped paying attention to the world, to current events, because I thought, what's the point? I bring this up only to say I understand the apathy and frustration that many feel with the state of the world. But I think closing yourself off from it is the wrong solution. If you listen to Nietzsche, the world should be affirmed in all its beauty and in all its ugliness. So educate yourself on both. See the beauty in solidarity and the ugliness in war. See the beauty in nature and the ugliness in its exploitation. See the beauty in the present moment and the ugliness in everything that would distract you from it. I've talked in previous videos about the power of mindfulness as a practice to refine one's thoughts, and I stand by that. There's a certain magic to an idea when it exists only in your mind. A bit of that magic is lost when you write it down, share it, perhaps find holes in it, then refine it further. But what's gained by these steps is magic in its own way. It might not seem like it, but the ability to have an open conversation is getting better. Noam Chomsky describes the difference in activism from the 60s to now. After 1967, for instance, the issue of Israel became a holy writ. You couldn't say a word against it. He speaks of Palestinian protests where he needed police protection. He speaks of environmental issues, of women's rights, war protests, solidarity movements, and even the nature of the state capitalist system. All of these, which were essentially out of the question in the 60s, you can now talk about freely. Technology also has brought benefits. Israeli historian Ilan Pappé says that a big reason that the younger generation is more aware of Israel's atrocities and more able to break free of Zionist indoctrination is because of the internet. Not to mention spaces such as this YouTube channel and several others, podcasts and books, community organizations. When used properly, technology has tremendous potential to bring us together and educate. Of course, this is not what our capital-fueled technology is today. It's algorithmic and sensational and extreme and ideological and reductionist, not to mention the censorship, and our relationship with it certainly needs to be right-sized. But that's a discussion for another video. Socrates, as far as Plato described him, understood the power of conversation. Plato's dialogues are essentially long-winded conversations that aim at coming to the most accurate possible definition of concepts like beauty, justice, and truth. Unfortunately, public discourse has become so politicized that disagreements are often treated as personal attacks. But private conversations about real issues in a non-judgmental environment, where you are given the grace to make mistakes, to learn and grow, that is what's missing. We've become isolationists, existing in online echo chambers, never challenging our views or seeking to understand the other side. Even among trusted friends and family, we are scared of conversation. We respect the other person and don't want to offend them, or we're worried about coming across as ignorant or ill-informed. I am as guilty of this as anyone, but I'm trying to get better. If we cultivate this kind of conversation, reject inflammatory online discourse, which only serves to divide, we will naturally find that we agree more often than we disagree. We don't need to be supercharged with vitriol and fanaticism. This leads to attacks on each other while the real perpetrators of violence, war, and genocide laugh all the way to the bank. Quote, "The United States is a divided country, but not in the way that's being discussed. It's divided between the public and the power systems." This channel, this video, and especially its companion, Manufacturing Consent for a Genocide, which probably won't end up being the actual name because of censorship, have been my admittedly minuscule efforts at starting this conversation. They've been my way of educating myself and hopefully educating some of you all in the process. I plan on including a guide to navigating our messy media landscape in the follow-up to this video, but if you really want to understand the world, the onus lies with you. Finally, if you have the financial means, I would encourage you to donate to any of the organizations listed in my description, which are providing direct relief to Palestinians as they try to rebuild and move towards hopefully a more peaceful time, which I'm cynical about, but we don't need to get into that. Please leave a like, a comment, share the video if you have enjoyed it. It really does help a lot. And that's all I got. Peace and love. Free Palestine, and I'll see you next time.